I've created a lot of content about the Canon M50 and with the Canon M50. And as I've said in previous videos, this is a great little camera to get started in video and for photography. And a lot of you guys are buying this camera and want to know how you can start using it to learn photography. And today that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. We're going to work step by step using the Canon M50 for photography. So all the photos that you saw there were taken on the Canon M50, and for more photos and videos and to keep up to date with the creative stuff that we're doing, make sure you go and check out the KaiCreative Instagram and Facebook socials. So first up, the simplest way to get started taking photos on the Canon M50 is to set the dial on the top of the camera to auto mode and then simply start snapping away, and the camera will make all the decisions for your settings. All you have to do is look through the viewfinder or on the LCD screen, hit the shutter, and that's the easiest way to start taking photos. Once you've taken a picture, you can press the blue play button here and you can run through those images via the LCD screen. So that's the easiest way to get started. But most of you want to go beyond using the auto mode. You want to actually learn how to use this camera in the manual mode, like a professional photographer. And the Canon M50 is perfect as a learner camera. Now, to learn about photography, we will need to cover the basics, and in particular, exposure. And essentially, exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor. Now, exposure can be controlled through three factors: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And these make up the exposure triangle. And you might have heard about these before. Now, don't worry if you have no idea what I'm talking about. Like I said before, we are going to break things down step by step so you have exactly what you need to have to get started with photography on the Canon M50. Now for this video, we will be using the kit lens that comes with the Canon M50, but later on we'll be looking at other lenses that are available, and we'll talk briefly about selecting different lenses and what types of photos you can take. Now if you look carefully at your lens when you take a picture, you will notice that there are blades that close up. And these affect the amount of light that is let into your camera and ultimately the amount of light landing on the sensor. And this is what we refer to as the aperture. It's kind of like the curtains in your house. If you open them wide, lots of light can come in, or if you only open them slightly, a smaller amount of light is let in. And we measure aperture using something called f-stops. And you will see this on your lens. So a number like 1.4, 2.8, f-stop 4. The smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture will be and the more light you will have hitting the sensor. So as an example, the Canon M50 kit lens has a zoom focal range of 15 to 45mm, also has a variable f-stop of 3.5 to 6.3, and this changes as you zoom the camera in on its focal length. So essentially all you need to remember is the smaller the number, the larger the aperture will be. So for this lens, more light will be let in when the f-stop is at 3.5 than at f-stop 6.3. To change the aperture on your M50, first of all turn your camera on and set it to manual mode by turning the dial to M. You can scroll through the LCD screens by selecting the info button here. And you can change the aperture settings manually using the buttons or using the touchscreen. If you're used to using a larger DSLR camera, you might find the button placement quite fiddly on the Canon M50. I think that using the touchscreen is easier for me. It's as simple as swiping to the values that you want, but we'll cover the settings using the button placement. And you can do that by pressing the info button till you get this screen here. And you can now change your aperture by pressing the Q set button here, and you can use the dial pad to move it to the aperture section if it's not set there already. And then turn the scroll wheel at the top of the camera and this will move you through the aperture values. And if we set it to wide open to the max f-stop of this lens, which is 3.5 at 15mm, we are now allowing the max amount of light onto the sensor that this lens will allow. And we can take a series of photos with different aperture values to highlight what the picture will look like as we move through the smallest to the widest f-stop numbers. So that's the f-stop, and that's how you control your aperture. Now, ISO refers to the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. And on the Canon M50, your camera has an auto mode and then goes from 100 up to 51,200 ISO. So if you have a very low ISO, like 100, the sensor is less sensitive to light. And if you have a higher ISO value, like 1600, it will be much more sensitive to light that is available, which will brighten up your picture. And really, a higher ISO will allow you to shoot in darker areas because your sensor is more sensitive to the light that is available. But what happens as you increase the ISO value is you also increase the level of noise or grain onto your picture. So to change the ISO on your Canon M50, all you need to do is tap the top button marked M.Fn and then turn the scroll wheel to select your ISO. And again, we can take some example pictures here with low ISO values all the way up to higher values to demonstrate what your picture will look like. So ISO is controlling the sensitivity of your camera sensor to the light that is available. Next on the list is shutter speed, and shutter speed is how long you want to leave the shutter open to let light in. It's like opening and closing your curtains. You can open and close them very quickly for a short burst of light, or you can open and close them slowly, allowing more light in over a longer period of time. And we measure our shutter speed in fractions of seconds. So on the M50, we can shoot up to 1/4000th of a second to really freeze motion, and all the way down to 30 seconds, which leaves the shutter open for a lot longer. And we can set this on our Canon M50 by simply turning the top scroll wheel left or right, and that controls the shutter speed directly. No need to press any other buttons. And again, we can highlight how changing your shutter speed affects your photos with some example pictures here. Fast shutter speeds allow you to freeze the motion in a picture, and slower shutter speeds can be used for things like long exposure photography, where we'll leave the shutter open for a longer period of time to create different effects with lights. And you can see some examples here where we use a slower shutter speed to create different effects using lights. For shutter speed, you can work at full manual, but the top dial also allows you to set your camera to shutter priority mode, and this is represented as TV. And this is where you decide your shutter speed and the camera decides what aperture you need. Another thing you might want to do if there's lots of action going on is to turn on the continuous shooting mode. And you can do this on the Canon M50 by going into the menu, going to the first page and scrolling down to drive mode and then changing it to high speed continuous. You can also set this via the camera menu by hitting the Q set button and using the dial pad to move down to the drive mode and selecting high speed continuous from there. And now you can take up to 10 shots a second. And with this option selected, you might also want to ensure that your autofocus is on to keep things in focus. So this is a good junction to talk about those focus points. The Canon M50 has 149 autofocus points, and you have several ways of controlling those points. First, you can access the autofocusing system by selecting Info, tapping the Q set button, and using the dial pad to move to the focusing points. And you have three options here. The first is autofocus and eye tracking, which is really useful for vlogging. For photography, you can also use this option and tap the LCD screen to take the photo. And for manual control, you can select Zone AF, which is quite a large focus box, and 1 point AF is a smaller focus point. And again, you can tap the LCD to take a photo, or you can move this focus area around by pressing on the focus points button here, and then moving your focus box area around using the dial pad. When you take a photo, that area will then be in focus. When it comes to photography, a lot of people say they like that blurry background effect, and this is referred to as a shallow depth of field. And depth of field is the focus relationship between the background and your subject of interest. And this is essentially controlled by your aperture. As we've mentioned before, your maximum aperture opening will be dependent on the lens that you are using. So if we look at this lens here, the Viltrox 56mm 1.4, the maximum aperture is 1.4, and that will allow a lot of light in, and we can really isolate our subject from the background using f-stop 1.4, essentially blurring out the background. And here are some examples of using the Viltrox 56mm 1.4 wide open at f-stop 1.4 to create photos with that shallow depth of field or blurred out background. Like the TV shutter speed priority button, the Canon M50 also has an aperture priority button, which is marked as AV, and this will allow you to set your aperture and the camera will choose the shutter speed for you. Additionally, your camera also has a portrait mode, which is marked as P, and in portrait mode, the camera will think that there's a subject in the foreground of the frame and choose a shallow depth of field to keep the human subject in focus, but the background blurred. Now, as you adjust your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings, you can take a meter reading of the amount of light by hitting this button here. This is the AE lock button and has a little star on it, and it will show you where your current exposure lies. Ideally, you want this line to fall in the middle or maybe slightly underexposed towards the -1 if you're going to do some editing of your photos later. But what you don't want is for your photos to be overly exposed or too underexposed, because then your photo will look too dark or too bright. And if you are overexposed or underexposed, you can start adjusting any one of those three parameters, your ISO, aperture, or shutter speed, to correct your exposure. But remember, if you have a high ISO, your picture is going to be grainy. If you open up your aperture, your background is going to be blurry. And if you use a slower shutter speed, movement in your pictures will also be blurry too. So hopefully you're starting to see the connection between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how all of these work around the light that is available to you. And really, a good tip here is to just play around with your lighting and composition with different camera settings and see what results you get. Another great option on the Canon M50 is the ability to shoot raw images. Now, a raw image is just that, an image that contains the raw data captured by the camera's sensor. So raw files are uncompressed. They take up more space than typical JPEG images, which are compressed images, but having the raw files gives you so much more creative freedom in your post-production work. So how do we set up our Canon M50 to shoot in RAW? Well, to do this, we can hit Menu, go to the very first camera option, and then the very first option again, called Image Quality. Move across to the RAW or the C-RAW option. C-RAW is a newer compressed version of RAW, and I know I just said that RAW is uncompressed, but the newer C-RAW files allow you to save more space on your SD card while retaining a lot more information than a JPEG image. You can also save a JPEG image at the same time as a RAW image by selecting one of these JPEG options here. So with some RAW files captured, let's very quickly jump into Photoshop to see how we might start to edit our photos. So I'm just looking at some photos that I took last year while we're in lockdown, just by the bridge, and I want to open up one of these raw images that I can start editing in Photoshop. So I'm going to take probably this photo here. So this is the JPEG version, and the one next to it here is going to be the raw. I'm going to open that up, and that will open us up in Photoshop. And this is obviously a fisheye lens. What we can start doing with this raw image is playing around a little bit with these settings. Put the exposure up a little bit, contrast it a little. I like to pull the highlights down a little here, maybe lift the shadows, pull the whites down, and I could also crush the blacks a little bit or lift them if I want a bit more detail in the face and also that softer look. I'll add in a little bit of texture and a little bit of clarity as well. Small bit of vibrance. Already starting to see how it's looking more punchier than when we started. Lift up the black slightly and we can make a little bit of an S curve here to add a little bit of contrast in. Now with the colors, we can actually start to manipulate the look and feel of this photo. One popular way of coloring photos and videos is to use the orange teal effect, and what we can do is pull the aquas down, pull the blues up, and we start to get a teal looking sky. And then playing around with the yellows, we can make things a little bit more orange, and we can also punch those reds. We've got to be careful with the oranges because then that will affect the skin tones, as you can see here. You can really pull out the detail. Obviously that's a bit too much, so we might want to be a little bit more subtle with that sky, and also rein in the greens as well. So having the raw files really lets you play around with the look and feel of your photos, and you can really make them pop in Photoshop and Lightroom. As you progress with your photography journey on the Canon M50, you might want to look at investing in other types of lenses that produce different sorts of effects. Zoom lenses for more background blur, wide angle lenses for different perspectives, fisheye lenses for really creative photography ideas, And another piece of kit that I found really useful on my Canon M50 has been this, the Viltrox Speed Booster, which allows me to use legacy EF glass on the M mount Canon M50, and this really opens up the camera to a lot of different lenses, and I would totally recommend you guys go check out the Viltrox Speed Booster, and what I'll do is I'll leave a little video of this in the description below. So hopefully that should be enough to get you started on your photography journey with the Canon M50. We did cover quite a lot of information in this video, so if there's anything that you're not 100% sure on, maybe just watch through the video again, or leave a question or comment down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So that's it from me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so already, do please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and hitting that little bell for notifications. So all that's left to say is stay creative, stay safe, imagine, implement, and inspire, and I'll see you next time on KaiCreative.